Hi, my name is Winston Linquister, and I'm a current undergraduate at Duke University. So, to those who may be wondering, the purpose of this podcast is to both fight stigma surrounding mental disability, as well as give a face or voice to those involved in disability studies, a field of study that is quite often unnoticed or unknown to many. Now, mind you, I don't have any real experience with video or audio editing, and this entire podcast is basically amateur. However, I hope either way these conversations can give to our audience a better understanding of disability studies and those involved in it. So thanks, I hope you enjoy, and have a great Disability Pride Week. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our final episode of the Mad Studies podcast for Disability Pride Week, your podcast for breaking down stigma and bringing the voices of disability studies right to you. It's been a very fun week, and I hope everyone's enjoyed getting to know our guests. I'm your host, Winston Linquister, and today our guest is Hailee Yoshizaki Gibbons, a PhD candidate in disability studies and a university fellow at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Hailee is a graduate student instructor for multiple classes involving the disability rights and draws on her own experiences with psychiatric disabilities for teaching. So with that, let's get started. Thank you, Hailee, for agreeing to come on our podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. No problem. Thank you again for agreeing to come on. So, Hailee, for those in our audience who may not be familiar with you or your work, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name's Hailee Yoshizaki Gibbons, and I am a PhD candidate, like you said, in disability studies. My particular interest in disability studies relates to intersections of aging and disability, with a particular emphasis on dementia. I have done a lot of work volunteering from a young age with people with dementia. And although I personally don't have dementia, I strongly relate to people with dementia because I have PTSD. And so I don't remember large portions of my childhood. And that has caused me to believe that the ability to remember or the ability to bring the past into the present, to form linear narratives, is not a prerequisite for personhood. And so that's really one of the main reasons that I've become so interested in dementia, but also passionate about increasing the inclusion of people with dementia in our society.
Great. So, you touched on a lot of different areas that I kind of want to ask about, but the first one that really stuck out for me was the idea of personhood and identity. So, how do you feel about that idea of identity in relation to diagnosed psychiatric disabilities?
I think identity is really complex when we think about diagnosis. In many ways, when I was younger, I really welcomed diagnoses. Even though at the time I didn't realize how they were pathologizing me in some ways, I felt that they gave me insight into who I was and what I was going through. And I think I also welcomed medicalization and pathologization because it gave me hope that I could be like fixed or cured. Um, and so I very was very into whatever my diagnosis was. But I think the more my diagnosis kept changing, I've had I think 5 or 6 different diagnoses throughout my life. The more I started questioning, what is the validity of these diagnoses? And a lot of times, and I'm not saying diagnoses have no validity. I mean, they still, for me, they give me a way to kind of communicate about my experiences in a way that dominant culture will understand. But I did start to wonder, what's the cost of these diagnoses? And really, are they actually based in medicine, or is it more of a social construction? And disability studies really helped me get to that place where I was questioning more, what is diagnosis? What does it look like? What are the ways that madness is socially constructed? Why are certain behaviors of mine deemed abnormal or even unacceptable by societal standards? So a lot of times I say I identify as having a psychiatric disability, and what I mean by that is that I have body-mind experiences that have been labeled by the psychiatric institution with a particular diagnosis. And a lot of times I will say, I kind of go back and forth. Sometimes I say I have bipolar. Sometimes I say I am bipolar. I'm a bipolar woman. And then sometimes I say I have a diagnosis of bipolar. And it kind of depends on the context and even just how I'm feeling that day. So sometimes I want to point out that it's a diagnosis, but other times I very much approach it from a point of reclamation. Like, yes, I have this diagnosis, I'm bipolar, and I'm proud of it. And so it's very complex, and I feel like my relationship to diagnosis is always changing, but it's definitely evolved in many ways since I became knowledgeable about disability studies. In many ways, I think my experience with disability has led disability studies to really, I guess what I'm trying to say is my disability has really inspired me in a lot of ways. Not in like an inspiration porn kind of way, but a way of seeing that, disability studies has helped me understand the ways that disability is socially constructed, and the ways that we can alter society, space, time, other constructs in order to create a society that is better for disabled people so that we have more livable lives.
Definitely. Now, before we get into that idea of kind of creating a better society that's more accessible for those with disabled lives, uh, what exactly were those costs that you mentioned in terms of the diagnoses that you received? You mentioned that you experienced, there was almost a cost to basically all those different diagnoses. And do you mind expanding on that?
Sure. I think a major cost was just, I think medicine socializes us to want an answer, and the kind of a right answer, sort of an objective capital T truth. And then when my diagnosis kept changing, it was weighing on me a lot. Like, what is going on with me? Why does this keep changing? Why isn't there like an answer? And I think the other major cost, of course, is that when you have diagnoses, in some ways, the way our healthcare system is currently structured, that gives you access to services. But in other ways, services almost become compulsory. I like after my first diagnosis, I was immediately referred to like psychiatric services. I was placed on medicine, and I very much wanted to be on medicine at that time. So in some ways, it was positive because it gave me access to those services. But the cost is that it did place me in the purview or under the control of psychiatric institutions. I feel very fortunate now. I have found a psychiatrist who is very supportive and into holistic health. She has actually let me go off medicine at various times when I have desired to, and then let me go back on when I have wanted to go back on. That is very abnormal in my experience for a psychiatrist. So a lot of times I think the cost is just that it puts us it puts us at risk for psychiatric interventions that we may or may not want, whether that's therapy, medication, even a hospitalization, institutionalization. And so I think a lot about those costs in terms of working within the psychiatric system.
So, in one of our previous emails, you actually detailed that you have kind of a mixed experience with the psychiatric health system. What were the positives that you received and also the negatives associated as well?
Yeah, so a lot of it I think has depended on who my providers are. I've had very negative experiences with therapists and psychiatrists. I had a psychiatrist who at first didn't want to put me on a medication. I was suicidal at the time, and he didn't want to put me on a medication because he said I was functioning very well and I had a really high GPA. And I had to really like fight to be placed on medication in that case, which was very stressful. This psychiatrist also diagnosed me with ADD and put me on Ritalin. And I kept communicating that I didn't like the way it made me feel, that it felt off. And he basically was just encouraging me to keep taking it. And so I ended up just stopping on my own, which in the psychiatric world is you shouldn't do, right? You're not supposed to stop medications without supervision. But yeah, so those are just really negative experiences where I didn't feel listened to. I felt very disempowered. I felt like the emphasis was all on just like, am I functioning? Can I contribute to society in a meaningful way, like as society deems it meaningful, right? Like I'm a student, and so I'm working and I'm getting a grade, so therefore I don't need medication because I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Um, and so those were just really negative experiences. I've also had really negative experiences with some therapists in regards to just various issues related to trauma. I've also had some really erasing experiences. I'm mixed race. I'm white and Asian, but I'm white passing. And I've had a lot of white therapists, just say really insensitive things to me about that or not understand why I identify as mixed race. They'll basically tell me like, well, you do look white. And so those kinds of things have really weighed on me. But I've also had wonderful experiences. Like I said, my psychiatrist now is I really feel like we're partners in my care. She has really allowed me to do a lot of different things and also encouraged me to look at my health more holistically than previous providers. Previous providers, I feel like I would report, oh, I'm having these symptoms or these symptoms are worsening, and they would just want to up my dosage, up my dosage, up my dosage, or add more medication. And my current psychiatrist has, we've looked a lot at like, what's my nutrition like? What am I eating? Am I able to exercise, and what would that look like? She recommended me like for a mindfulness workshop, which I did try. Those kinds of things that she's not like mandating any of them, but she's really just trying to help me figure out what works best for me. How can I, manage my like what the quote unquote symptoms that I have in a way that works for me. And similarly, I've also had really positive experiences with some therapists who have been extremely supportive and extremely caring and have really um, some therapists, I think, very much go through this kind of medical approach. What are your symptoms? What's going on with you? But I've also had therapists who really take a more holistic approach, asking more about how I'm feeling, what kinds of support I need, how can I get those support from the people around me, that kind of thing. So it definitely has been mixed. And I also feel fortunate I have not been hospitalized. I've had several friends that are hospitalized, have been hospitalized, and that seems to almost always be a very, very difficult experience. But luckily, I have not had providers that have forced me into that. I have had providers that have recommended it, but respected my decision to say no.
Hmm. Now, you mentioned very interestingly the question of like caring for function. Like, are you functional in society? Would you say that that is probably where the stigma surrounding mental disability lies, or could it be in other areas as well?
I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, in our neoliberal capitalist society, we are obsessed with production. Are you producing? Are you contributing? And we only define producing and contributing in these very specific ways related to things like work and school and output. And so I think that's definitely a part of the stigma. Is a lot of people don't understand. It's if a person with a psychiatric disability needs to um, rest long periods of time or stay inside. That doesn't fit into our norms of productivity. If they need to take more time to do things, that doesn't fit into our norms of productivity. So I think that's definitely one source of stigma. I think another source of stigma is just, we have very strong norms in our society related to behaviors and how we interact with others, how we interact with, space, how we move our bodies even. And so I think a lot of the stigma comes from a lack of understanding of neurodiversity and realizing that we all have different body-mind experiences, and some of us are pathologized for our body-mind experiences. But that doesn't make us any less human. So I think there are many sources of stigma. But yeah, I definitely think that the issue of production is definitely a major one.
Okay. And uh, sorry, you did mention that one of the big things that you were, or that really helped you with or the more positive experiences within the medical system was one where it seemed like more of a two-way street, where you were interacting with your therapist or psychiatrist, and they were interacting with you back, kind of to meet you halfway. How can we, or how can that approach really help with just people coping with various mental disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge with that is that it can be difficult to find those providers. Like I said, I've had some very negative experiences, and I've had many friends who have sought, for example, therapy, and they have negative experience, and it's really difficult, and they don't go back. You know, like kind of quote unquote shopping for a provider can be really trying and really stressful. Um, you know, but I think if you're able to do it, it's definitely can be rewarding. It's just a question of, you know, do you have the the mental, you know, energy and capacity at the time to really engage in that process of searching and trying to find that provider that will work with you in that way. I think that's an unfortunate aspect of the psychiatric system is it kind of all seems to depend, in my experience, a lot of it seems to depend on like who is providing my services. And you know, and then of course there's also so many people that don't even have access to services at all. Or if they do, they don't have choice. Like I'm in a privileged position as a graduate student. Even though in some ways I'm underinsured with the insurance that's provided, I also do have options. So there are, you know, many people who don't even have the options to pursue medical care. And then also, of course, there are different cultural norms around doing so. So I think there are a lot of barriers to creating that partnership. You know, I think if you can find it, it's wonderful. But I think we also need to think about like how can we change the psychiatric system? How can we educate providers so that more of them are providing this kind of support? And how can we decrease barriers so that if people do want psychiatric services and supports, they can access them?
So, I mean, I guess the natural follow-up is how can we reduce these barriers, not just within the medical system, but also just within society?
Well, we just need to completely change society, so pretty easy. I think that, I mean, a major thing, of course, is just if we had, you know, more universal health care. And right now we know that healthcare is a huge issue. And I was very grateful to see that the American Health Care Act was not voted on yesterday, and Obamacare was not repealed. I think we're living in a very difficult time where what we need is an expansion of healthcare, an expansion of services, but it's very likely or risky that we may see a decrease in those. So we definitely need, one, more legislation that's going to actually support people getting the care that they need. And then for some insurance providers, mental health services are an afterthought or just not adequate. I remember when I was growing up, my father is a firefighter, and the firefighting insurance is, of course, through the city, which it was considered very good insurance, but the mental health coverage was terrible, which is very interesting because, you know, firefighters are seeing really traumatic things on a regular basis. But that just kind of goes to show you that it's just considered like an afterthought in some insurance plans. And then of course we also just need more community-based services. A huge fear with if Obamacare is repealed is that disabled people are going to experience re-institutionalization. And what we really need is more community-based services. As disabled people, we have the right to live in the community. So that is another huge issue that I think is going to be grappled with over the next few years. And I mean, in terms of society, I mean, it's a really big question. I think a lot of it, again, is just a lot of it's going to be related to education and awareness, but also just creating different spaces. You know, of course, changing environments. addressing attitudinal barriers. Our social structures are just so embedded with ableism, but also with sexism and racism and classism and transphobia and heterosexism, and the list goes on. Ageism, of course, and so we really need to, in some ways, dismantle a lot of our current institutions. But a huge one that comes to mind is just the prison industrial complex, which is both confines disabled people, but also causes a lot of disability. And of course, that is a system ingrained with racism and classism and ableism. And so I think about the ways that we need to dismantle those oppressive social structures if we're going to really change society for people with psychiatric or mental disabilities.
Okay. Now you mentioned this aspect of community and community health, and a lot of other people that I've interviewed have also mentioned this area of community. Can you touch on or expand on that, any experiences with community that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. When I was an undergrad, I wasn't out about having a psychiatric disability, or I would have called it a mental illness at the time, because I hadn't been introduced to disability studies yet. But I kept it a secret, and that required a ton of mental and emotional energy. I basically felt like I was putting on an act everywhere I went, anytime I interacted with people, with friends, with professors, with supervisors at work. I never felt like I could really be myself. And I did kind of peripherally know like some other friends that were struggling with various issues, but we never really talked about it. Um, and so it was a very isolating experience. And I didn't at the time know, I did not have a disability identity at all. I mean, I really felt there was something wrong with me and that I needed to hide it as much as possible so that I could fit into society as much as possible. And of course, some days I was able to do that better than others. And after I started developing a disability identity, I started seeking out spaces in which disabled people would be present. And I, have now met a lot of people with very diverse disabilities, but including psychiatric disabilities. And I have some of my closest friends have psychiatric disabilities. And to be in community with them has really completely changed my experience in my life. I really feel that I have a strong support system that I can lean on. I have people I can talk to about what I'm experiencing who aren't going to pathologize me or tell me that I need to just try harder or suck it up or try yoga. So that's just been a huge for me, like a huge source of support. And I also have people who understand, I can't do everything that I say I'm going to do, or I might be late to certain things, or I might not show up at all. And they understand that that's not about them or about me not caring about them. It's just about me prioritizing self-care. So to have a community that understands that, I think is just it's really completely changed how I experience my psychiatric disability.
And for any members of our audience who may be trying to look for that sense of community, where would you say they can find it?
Well, if they're college students, I think definitely in disability studies courses, if your university offers them. But there's also just in a lot of places there are disability community formed and through, like when disability artists or musicians have performances. You can look for disability activist groups. There are even disability support groups that can form a source of community. I have a friend who is about to join a support group for autistic adults, and so those kinds of groups or spaces are definitely a good starting point. I think also because I have many psychiatric disabilities and are of course not a parent. I do have to disclose in order to find others. But I really have had and in general, of course, I've been careful about when and how I disclose, but like in those spaces, disclosure has always been empowering and has always allowed me to connect with others. So I definitely think that and smaller, and I guess what I'm thinking of right now though is a challenge might be if you're in like a rural area. Um, but again, another great source is just online. I've been part of several online communities that have been, helpful to me. So I, I think there's a lot of different ways, depending on your preferences, but also your geographic area, what kinds of access you have to transportation, or what kind of access you have to certain spaces. Um, Hopefully, people can find the community they're looking for.
Hmm. Now, you mentioned empowerment. You said in one of your previous emails that actually finding disability studies and going into that field was an area of empowerment for you. Why was it empowering for you?
I think the biggest reason is that disability studies led me to question and critique what my experience had been with diagnosis, with the psychiatric system. Um, it moved me from seeing myself as someone who was mentally ill and needed to be fixed or cured to seeing myself as someone that is disabled and that experiences a lot of prejudice and discrimination because of society, not because of anything inherently wrong with my body mind. um, and of course, it also led me, like I was previously just saying, to find community. And so I think in many ways, disability studies has really changed the way that I view my own identity, and also the way I view community. And it's also led me to, um, like I was saying earlier, to even think about the ways I relate to people with other impairments like dementia. Um, I started volunteering with people with dementia when I was 16 years old, and I was always so drawn to it. And a lot of my peers were very afraid of people with dementia. And before I started interacting with them, I was afraid too. There's a lot of really negative stereotypes and stigma about people with dementia. But I never could really put my finger on why I was so drawn to them and why I related to them so much on this deeper level. And when I entered disability studies, I really saw that I was identifying with the ways in which I felt, in some ways dehumanized when I couldn't engage in forms of memory or recollection or linear narratives that people were expecting. Um, and so I think it's also just helped me better understand myself and how I interact with the world, and of course, help me understand the societal context in which I live.
All right, great. And if you don't mind, could you add a, or could you go into a little bit more depth of your experiences with psychiatric disability, whether it be PTSD or diagnosis of bipolarism?
Go into more detail. Sorry, can you?
Just go into a little bit more detail of your experience with your diagnoses of whether of your diagnoses of psychiatric disability, whether it be PTSD or bipolarism.
Okay. Well, like I said, I've had numerous diagnoses. So for many years, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. Um, and I also, at one point, got diagnosed with dysthymia, which is basically a chronic depression. I was diagnosed with adult ADD, or ADHD. Um, and when I came to my current psychiatrist, I basically shared some of this history with her. There were a few other diagnoses that I'm not even remembering right now, but she did something no psychiatrist has ever done with me, and she traced kind of like my whole what I could remember about my childhood or being an adolescent and all the way to now. And she, said that she felt like a lot of what I was experiencing actually aligned more with bipolar disorder. Um, and when she told me about the ways that bipolar disorder can manifest, so I have bipolar disorder, I have what's considered type 2. So type 1 is the one that most people know about, where you experience depression and mania. I experience, as someone with type 2, something called hypomania, which is basically a less intense form of mania. And a lot of times it doesn't get diagnosed because hypomania actually makes people hyperproductive. We don't necessarily, some people do, but not all. Like, for example, I don't engage in a lot of the what's considered high risk behaviors when I'm hypomanic. So, for example, the psychiatric institution has indicated that mania might come with things like spending a lot of your money or gambling, having a lot of unprotected sex with multiple partners. I mean, all these things that they basically pathologize, various behaviors that they pathologize. With hypomania, since it's a lessened form, you often don't engage in those kinds of behaviors that have been labeled in that way. So, for example, I would just not sleep very much. I would work all the time. And I would have a lot of racing thoughts, a lot of really like good ideas that I would often end up executing. And so I really didn't have like a problem, of course, with that, because that fits well into what our society expects from people. But the issue that did come is when I'm hypomanic. I guess there's two issues I experience. One, I'm extremely irritable and impatient with those around me, which causes me to lash out at people, to say things I don't mean, and to interact with people in ways that don't reflect like my own values. And actually, one of my very close friends lived with me during a period that I was hypomanic but didn't know it. And I'm very grateful for her for putting up with me and still being my friend, because that was like a really difficult time in which I am, regretful of the way that I acted towards her. And a lot of times, of course, I would apologize after, but it's like I couldn't stop the impulse of acting the way that I was. And then the other issue with hypomania is it almost always, for me, is followed with a depressive episode. So it's like I go high and then I fall. Versus, now my goal is just to remain more I want to kind of go like this instead of like this, if you will, in terms of my moods. And so the diagnosis itself, it made a lot of sense to me and kind of put things more in context for me, in terms of like my previous like struggles and what I was going through. And also kind of changed the way that I was approaching how I was like taking care of myself. So, for example, my psychiatrist told me like you shouldn't have been on these antidepressants. Some of them can actually trigger hypomania, and she was like, you definitely should not have been on the Ritalin. That is like not good for people with bipolar disorder. And so she has put me on different medications. We've tried quite a few different medications that are more with the goal of mood stabilization rather than just like antidepressants. So yeah, I'm actually, even though I still, like, of course, diagnoses are still socially constructed, and I question kind of the quote unquote like how behaviors are labeled problematic, in mania or hypomania, and then also in depression. But at the same time, my diagnosis has helped me kind of just put like a name to like what I experience, and also it holds meaning in our society. Like when I say I have bipolar, people have a general idea of what that means. Now, it also comes with a lot of stigma, because of course people don't fully understand it. They know that it's a quote unquote mental illness, but a lot of times, they react with like uncertainty, or I've even had someone, or actually not someone, like I've had multiple people say like that they don't want to make me mad. I don't know if they think I'm gonna like Incredible Hulk it or something. Um, but like, so it's kind of like a mix of positive and negative. It's like I have this diagnosis, I recognize the way it's socially constructed, but also like it gives me access to the services and supports I want. It gives me access to medication. So it's a very mixed experience. I experience like a lot of conflict internally, I guess, related to how I think about my experience with diagnosis. But I do really feel that the medications I'm on now are really making a difference for me in a way that my previous medications did not. And I'm also very open. Like I said, there have been periods where I've gone off medications, and my psychiatrist has been supportive of that. And I'm open to kind of flexibility, changing what I'm doing depending on what I need and what I'm going through, what I'm experiencing.
Hmm. So, basically, to any members of our audience who may be struggling with some of the adversities of being diagnosed with bipolarism and the ensuing stigma, what would you say to them as encouragement, or yeah, basically just as encouragement or advice?
I feel like that's a hard question. I don't know if I have advice, as much as I just want to say that, I for like my fellow people with psychiatric disabilities, I want to say that, I see you and I hear you, and I know some of the pain that you're experiencing, both internally but also with the ways that people interact with you. And I guess like I want people to know they're not alone, and that it can feel very disempowering to have a diagnosis or to be in the psychiatric system, but that I hope that they can, cultivate the kinds of service and supports, whether it be in the psychiatric system or in their own community with their family and friends, that are meaningful to them, and that can just help them, give them the support that they need. It's so hard to give advice because everyone's experience with psychiatric disability is so different. That's another interesting thing to me about diagnosis is, I've met people diagnosed with similar psychiatric disabilities to me, and sometimes we have experiences that align, and many times we do not. And so it's since there's so much diversity within our community, I'm hesitant to kind of give blanket advice, but I do want people to know that they're not alone, and that that there are others that understand what they're going through, on a personal level.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So one area or one aspect of this podcast is to discuss disability studies and MAD studies in particular. So in one of our past correspondences, you've mentioned that you do teach classes on disability studies. Do you mind expanding on that for our audience?
Yeah, so I teach two classes. I teach our Disability and Human Development capstone, and this is a culmination course for minors and soon majors in our Disability and Human Development program. And the students engage in a service learning experience where they work with a community partner who works with people with disabilities. And so the students do a variety of different things. Some of them are doing research, some of them are doing work one-on-one with people with disabilities, some are increasing accessibility, some are like working on disability culture events. So they do a lot of different projects. And the goal is really for them to be able to put what they've learned in their disability studies courses into practice, and also see all the tensions that arise when you try to put theory into practice, when you engage in practice, but also help them understand all the possibilities that can come from implementing disability studies theories in spaces that may or may not already be using them. And then I also co-teach a class called Disability Rights and Culture. And that class looks at disability rights and justice movements and then how they intersect with disability culture. And I am out as a disabled person in my classes. And I regularly refer to my experience with diagnoses of bipolar. Sometimes I also discuss PTSD, but more often I discuss bipolar. I think that it helps my students understand when I can give these personal examples, it kind of helps bring a lot of the material to life for them and helps them see the ways in which I, as one individual, am affected by how our society is structured and how our culture, views and treats disabled people. And another amazing thing that has happened with my disclosure is that it's led a lot of other disabled students to come out or to come to me and say, I really identify with what you're saying. It's also allowed me to mentor a lot of students. I've shared in several of my classes that as a graduate student, as a graduate student instructor, I'm kind of in between student and faculty. And I've shared with them that for my own courses, I'm registered with the Disability Resource Center. I receive accommodations. That's actually led a lot of students to come to me saying, I'm thinking about registering. Can you tell me more about the process and what do accommodations look like for people like us? Because they imagine accommodations for people with physical disabilities very easily, which I mean in itself is kind of a fallacy because accommodations are never a one size fits all. But they can see, okay, this person needs an accessible room. This person needs, an elevator, for example, a ramp. And they have a harder time imagining, as a person with a psychiatric disability, what kind of accommodations are available to me. And so it's allowed me to mentor them and be really creative of thinking what do you experience in class that's a barrier to your learning? Maybe it's just the fact that you're sitting still for an hour and a half and maybe you start to experience some kind of distraction or difficulty concentrating. What if you were able to stand up and move about the room, or what if you were able to just leave the room for 5 minutes to take a break? Those kinds of conversations have been really powerful. And sometimes I haven't had students come up to me, but I remember last semester I was very touched because on one of my course evaluations, a student wrote, that I really am proud of my disability and that it inspired her to be proud of her disability. And that really touched me, even though this student never talked to me about this. It made me think of the ways that even when students aren't coming to me and coming out to me, seeing someone who shares similar body-mind experiences to them in the classroom, teaching them about disability rights, disability culture, I think it can be very empowering for students. At the same time, I acknowledge there are a lot of risks to being out. In a couple years, I'll be on the job market, and from my course evaluations sometimes reference my psychiatric disability. If you look at my curriculum vitae, I presented papers, I've written about psychiatric disability, and so it's going to be likely clear to people who may think about hiring me that I have psychiatric disabilities, and I don't know what that will mean for my own prospects for employment. And of course, it's also risky now because there are students who may not respect me anymore, may not see me as a valid source of information, may think that I don't even deserve to be in the classroom. And so, I recognize disclosure is very complex, and it really, depends a lot on the context that you're in, and whether you feel that you can disclose and be safe. For me, I disclose, even though I'm very hyper aware of the risks, but I disclose in many spaces, especially teaching, because I think about how alone I was as an undergraduate, and I want my undergraduates to know that what they're going through is something that many people experience, and that they can find support and community in others. And also, I want students to understand that for many people, disability studies, it's not just academics. It's personal. It really affects our lived experience, our day-to-day lives. And so I draw on my own personal experience a lot to connect the personal and the political in my teaching.
Hmm. So, especially in a university setting, what would you say are some of the basic steps that can be taken to either increase accommodations for students with disabilities or increase awareness of disability studies?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, I mean, there are still lots of universities that don't have disability studies, but we are a growing field, which really excites me, and it's my hope that that trend continues over the years. Disability touches all of our lives in some way, whether we are disabled or whether we, have family members or friends who are disabled. Um, and so I think it's just such an important field for people to be introduced to and for people to have access to. And I think especially for disabled students, having the ability to take courses that teach you about disability rights, disability culture, it can be so empowering. Of course, most people don't learn about those things in K-12 education, or if they do, it's glossed over very quickly. And so to have courses that really focus in on disability and also the way disability intersects with gender and race and class and sexuality and age, I think it's just critically important. So, I mean, a huge hope is just that there are increased programs and courses offered in a variety of universities. Um, in terms of accommodations, I think a huge issue that I see with the students I work with is I've had a lot of students come to me and share negative experiences with other faculty at my university regarding accommodations. These faculty view accommodations as special treatment, as a burden and inconvenience to them. And so they've made it more difficult for these students. I've also heard some very troubling stories about, faculty asking students to disclose in the middle of class, like basically asking like who here has this diagnosis or who here has a mental illness, quote unquote. And then one of my students actually was in that situation and raised their hand, and the professor proceeded to tell the class that that none of like this person's experiences were real. And so it was just extremely invalidating. So I think a huge issue is just there needs to be a lot of education around what accommodations are and how they actually are reducing barriers to education, not providing special treatment. And then I think another huge issue is just going beyond accommodation, looking more at access more holistically. Accommodations are very kind of like individualized, you have to request them. But it's like, how can we just increase access in general at our university, in our classrooms, at our events? How can we embody the principles of universal design, more and really follow those in the ways that we're thinking about the spaces that we create, the events that we hold. So I think that's another huge way that that accommodations and access can be considered like in a larger university setting.
Hmm. Thank you. So we're kind of reaching the end of our time limit, but before we go, are there any last minute things that you'd like to tell us about? Any areas that you wanted to touch on that we never really got to? Basically, the floor is open to you for any last messages or words that you wanted to let out.
Um, I don't think there's anything that we were unable to touch on that. I think a lot of what we discussed was what I was planning to or hoping to discuss. I think I just want to I guess add one thing, which is that not everyone has access to diagnosis. And so you may be experiencing various um, sorry, let me like restructure the sentence. So you may be experiencing things that are, somehow like affecting you, but not have access to diagnosis and therefore not have access to services and supports in the psychiatric system. Of course, hopefully you can access supports in your own circles, but I want to say that diagnosis is not necessarily like not an does not have to be a part of disability identity. You can identify as disabled or neurodivergent and not have a diagnosis. I think that's really important. I've been saying throughout this podcast, even I have a fraught relationship with diagnosis. It's very complex, and so I guess I think it's if you feel or identify as disabled, then you are to me. I'm actually like part of a research team right now that's looking at experiences of disabled students, staff, and faculty at our university, and we get some interesting questions like they'll share their diagnosis, whatever that may be, and ask like, "Am I qualified for this study?" But really, the only criteria we have is that you identify as disabled. We don't need your diagnosis. We don't need proof that you have sought medical treatment. If you identify, then you are. And so I just want to emphasize that since I know that for many people, they don't have access to diagnosis or they might not want diagnosis. They might not want pathologization. So I think that's an important point I do want to add.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you so much
Thank
for your
you.
time. All right, everybody, that was Hailee Yoshizaki Gibbons, and thanks again, Hailee.
Thank
So,
you.
so with that, we end our coverage of the disability studies throughout Disability Pride Week. Thanks again to our audience and everyone who's contributed to our product. To our project. It wouldn't be what it is if it wasn't for you. And I hope this has truly been an eye-opening experience for everyone involved. And thanks again. Have a good day.